worst thing I ever saw at a Waffle House started as one of the nicest things I'd ever seen at a Waffle House. There's probably something deeply philosophical in there somewhere, but I'll be damned if it's me that's finding that. So, me and a fellow buddy stopped by a Waffle House in Gainesville a few years back, first and last time we ever stopped there. Then, as we're eating, a man comes walking through the doors and gets the reception of a minor celebrity, and we soon figured out why. The moment after the guy walked through the doors, different groups at different tables started trying to get his attention. It was just after 2 a.m, but the place was still really busy because it had all the Saturday night drinkers in there. So there was a whole bunch of people calling out, "Mr. Brewer, over here, Mr. Brewer," and stuff like that. My buddy and I were like, what's going on? But like I said, we soon found out. Mr. Brewer was obviously some kind of big shot, or at least he sure played it that way, because he starts walking to each of the tables that seem to recognize him and handing out wads of cash. And he's not just giving them the money. He's sitting down with them, talking to them, asking about their families and their jobs and stuff. Real pillar of the community type things. And some folks are refusing the money and are just happy to check in with him, but others, and I mean no offense by this, look like they needed it, you know? So they seemed only too happy to take his money. Anyway, this guy carries on going from table to table, then when he seemed done with his rounds, he stood up and waved goodbye to everyone as he walked towards the doors. But then, as he's walking, some lady in the back starts calling out something like, "Why didn't you pay for our meal?" I looked over, and the lady and her old man were looking over at this Mr. Brewer guy, and they looked mad. Mr. Brewer starts telling them that he can't pay for everyone's meal. But this doesn't go down well with the lady and her man, and she starts saying how Brewer there was trying to embarrass them or something. And by this point, people were telling the lady to shut up, and this is making her man even madder, talking about, "Don't you talk to my woman that way." But Mr. Brewer is chill, tells everyone to pipe down, then basically explains that if they're going to be so rude, he's most definitely not paying for their food. People start clapping and cheering, and it's all amped up to 11 because most people are drunk out of their minds. But again, the rude couple do not take this well, and the angry man gets up, marches toward Mr. Brewer, and takes a swing at him. The guy is drunk, and Brewer seems sober as a judge, so the swing completely misses, and then people are jumping in to separate them and push the instigator out of the Waffle House. There were people keeping him outside, people making sure Mr. Brewer was okay, and people yelling at the rude lady to get outside and control her man. My buddy and I are just trapped in the middle of all that chaos, so we're both just like, let's get the hell out of here. And after taking a few final sporkfuls of food, we got up and head towards the door, right in time for the shooting to start. I didn't see where the shots came from, but I saw Mr. Brewer just buckle and hit the floor. Then the next thing, someone's getting wrestled to the ground outside, and the cops showed up just in time to put the cuffs on him while folks outside helped hold him down. And the shooter was that angry guy trying to defend his woman's honor or whatever. And he just killed a man because he wouldn't give them money to pay for his waffles. I think that was probably the worst thing I ever saw, not just in a Waffle House either, ever. And my mom loved that movie, To Kill a Mockingbird, and I once asked her why it was called something like that when there was no mockingbirds in it. And she told me it was because it was the worst kind of sin to kill a mockingbird, because all they did was sing and make folks happy. And I feel like that's what angry guy with the gun did. He killed a mockingbird. And I just pray that he realizes what he did and what a terrible, terrible sin it was.
Hey guys, thanks so much for all the support. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please feel free to do so.
My grandpa had one hell of a war. He turned 18 in December of '43, got drafted almost right away, then landed in France sometime in the fall of '44. His outfit was some kind of supply company that operated to the rear of the front line, so he didn't see much actual fighting. All he did was load trucks, drive someplace, and then unload them. Then just a few months later, the leader of Deutschland, as you know him, blew his brains out. The war was over, but my grandpa's service was not, and instead of heading home like a lot of the battle-hardened infantry units, Grandpa stayed in Germany and continued to load trucks. Then one day, some high-ranking officer showed up at my grandpa's unit and starts asking where he is. My grandpa's name was Murphy. He's Irish, but only on my great-grandpa's side. His mother had been a German immigrant and had spoken a heck of a lot of the old language around him when he was a kid. So much so that despite not being able to speak German, he could sure as heck understand it. There was such a demand for translators at the time that Army intelligence was searching up anyone of even the slightest German heritage in hopes that they'd be able to help translate documents or interpret conversations. But then, in the case of my grandpa, he was given a very different kind of task. When he'd confirmed that my grandpa could understand enough German to be of use to him, the officer told him to get into his Jeep. Then off they drove to some intelligence unit where my grandpa and a bunch of other soldiers could get a short briefing. Long story short, they were to pose as guards in various prisoner of war camps, but their real job was to just listen. Anyone higher than a private first class was to receive a very temporary demotion, and each of them was to master the art of looking very bored and very dumb. My grandpa said the first part was easy, because for the most part, German POWs talked about the same crap American soldiers did. They complained about the latrines, about the food, and about each other, all very inoffensive stuff. Then one by one, depending on the kind of stuff that they'd been up to during the war, they were either hanged, forced into labor battalions, or given their freedom. My grandpa said that over the months that followed, his camp's population kept shrinking and shrinking until there were rumors that they were going to close the place down altogether. Then one day, hundreds of these SS guerrillas marched right up to the camp's gates, flying this big old white flag, and asked to surrender. Turns out this rogue unit of Germany's most loyal bodyguards had been hiding out in the woods for months, and when they weren't taking pot shots at Americans, they were terrorizing the local Germans for collaborating with the U.S. Friendly forces had been trying to starve the rogue unit out for a while, so they figured their surrender was simply a natural result of their efforts. There was just one problem. The camp's guard contingency had been scaled down as the number of prisoners began to dwindle, meaning that by the time these SS guys showed up, there were 8 prisoners for every 1 American camp guard. At first, the camp's commander was somehow completely fine with this and saw it was an opportunity to prove how just a handful of American boys could keep a lid on hundreds of rabid SS. But he was wrong, and if it hadn't been for my grandpa, a lot of people would have paid with their lives. Grandpa said that one day he was on guard duty when, for the first time during his whole stay at the POW camp, he heard something that sounded vaguely suspicious. All these hardened SS prisoners had been on their best behavior. Not a single one had stepped out of line. But then after my grandpa overhears one say to another, "How much longer will we have to wait?" which was a fairly common question among the prisoners, the other replied, "Warten auf das Signal," which means, "We wait for the signal." Now obviously, my grandpa is thinking, what signal? But he had also been explicitly ordered to report anything like that to his superiors. Words like plan, plot, or code, these were all things that were of great interest because the main goal by that point was to prevent war criminals from escaping or destroying evidence of their crimes. But signal, that was something else entirely. The second his superiors heard about someone throwing the word signal around, they flooded the camp with extra guards, then got my grandpa to point out the soldiers that he'd heard use it. Sometime later, I imagine after an extensive period of interrogation, one of the SS guys finally talks and gives up their whole crazy plan. You see, all these SS fanatics might have showed up flying a white flag, but they hadn't really surrendered. Like I mentioned, they'd been hiding out in the area for months, following out Germany's final order to fight to the bitter end. but they never hit the POW camp on account of it being full of Germans. They also never opted to mount any kind of prison break, but by that time, that was neither here nor there, I guess. And so one day, a few SS scouts snuck up to the camp and happened to notice that there was only a handful of prisoners, but more importantly, only about 24 camp staff and guards. They reported this back to their commander, who came up with an extremely fiendish plan: fake a surrender, overwhelm the camp guards, then loot weapons and ammo to continue their partisan struggle against the Americans. But the SS didn't just want weapons and ammo. Oh no, they had a much bigger prize in mind, and that prize was American uniforms. If they could disguise themselves as Americans in unblemished uniforms, the SS could mount devastating attacks on our boys, especially if you had an SS soldier disguised as, say, an American officer, of which there were plenty of the camp staff. By overhearing that word signal and bringing it to the attention of his superiors, my grandpa saved countless lives. So many, in fact, that his superiors sought to award him a Bronze Star. I thought they only gave those things out for combat-related heroism. Turns out they award them for other things too. They just gotta be real significant kinds of things to be worth considering. The whole thing made him a minor celebrity among the boys he served with, and around 6 months later, he was discharged and sent home. My grandpa never considered himself a hero. He always said that he was simply doing his job. But I got the medal and the citation that proves that he saved, and I quote, scores, if not hundreds of lives. And to me, that's just about plain a definition of a hero as it's possible to get.
Have you ever had one of those days where you think that a place that could be responsible for feeding a lot of people, a place that can be a stop for the travelers, and in all, a place that can be a haven to the food lovers who turn out to be the bloody battlegrounds between two kids enraged with hormones and pure intention of killing each other? And to bear witness to such monstrosity as a child is something of a trauma that I just cannot seem to get over with, even though now I have learned to cope with it. But there are nights when the incident of a night at McDonald's haunts the life out of me. It was the damn 80s. Everything was changing in front of our eyes. Life was pacing at a speed where you had to either catch up or get left behind. And I was not the one to get left behind. I was a kid. I must have been 12 or 13. Pretty grown up and pretty much capable of imagining the scenarios in the most vivid way possible. I had a friend, Carl. Carl had the same interests and we hung out a lot and talked about a lot of things: Star Wars, basketball, and a lot of science stuff. We were practically nerds. Carl, like every boy in the school, had a crush on Sydney, but I don't think Sydney knew it because Sydney probably knew that the whole school crushes on her. So in the vastness of school, where there are artists, jocks, and practically everyone above than a nerd like Carl and me, so Sydney probably didn't even know that Carl exists. But Carl was in love with her. At least that is what he said to me. I told him to confess his feelings about her. He refused, and I told him, "Look, man, there's nothing to lose here, is there? Sydney probably doesn't even know that you exist, so the worst that could happen is that she will say no. But even then, it is the best thing that she will know you." It was the much-needed optimism that Carl needed, and he pushed himself to confess his feelings before the term ends. And he decided to act on my motivation, and mustered enough courage to go and tell her everything. He went on to confess everything. And as he walked over to her, she said, "Oh, hi, Carl." He came back and told me that she knew who he was, and she wants her help with the project. It was a great day for my friend Carl. The guy loved her for so long, and now finally, he had the chance to be with her. He waited for her at her home. It was really amazing that a girl like that would have anything to do with us, the geek and nerds. It was something unbelievable for us. The next morning, I waited for him to tell me what all had gone down, and then he said she never showed up. I consoled my friend and told him that it's all right. Maybe she was caught up, and then he said that he saw her walking into the neighborhood McDonald's when he was running an errand. Carl was angry and wanted to confront her about it, but she wasn't in the school. And then an emergency assembly was called, and it was declared that she was murdered last night. This was something that put my friend into shock, and he couldn't even process his grief, so he stayed silent for a while, and then walked out of assembly. And probably because he was the last one to see her, he quickly decided that there is something that police should know, and straight away walked out of the school and told police about seeing Sydney enter McDonald's late. Carl was an emotional wreck, and then one day after missing for a week of class, he came back and told me, "It is the cashier at the McDonald's. He killed her." I told him he was being irrational if he did that. The police will catch him. He should inform the police about it, and then he said he did, but they don't believe him either. He said, "I just want you to be there when I confront him." I agreed to do it. It's the least bit that I can do. We went to that McDonald's to confront him and waited for the time when there were less people in the joint, and we found the perfect time at around 10 at night, and we entered, and Carl decided to confront him. But the cashier got really agitated with the questioning, us knowing that we are weak to do anything. He wasn't going to give us anything. And then I don't know when my friend did what he did, and there was knife stabbing right across the cashier's hand, and he was screaming in pain. And then my friend took the knife and put it around his neck, and then the cashier retaliated and was now punching Carl, but then Carl stabbed him again, but this time the knife fell out of his hand. Without a weapon, intimidation is something that neither Carl was good at nor me. But then in the gist of things, Carl took a revolver out of his sock and pointed toward the cashier, and he stopped in his path and looked at us in fear. And Carl screamed, "Admit that you killed Sydney." And I was taping the whole thing for the evidence, and then he said, "Yes, I killed her. I didn't mean to. She came in looking so hot and beautiful. I asked her where she was going, and she said that she was meeting a potential future boyfriend, and I said that I'm going to be her boyfriend. She said no." As the man kept on talking, I saw that my friend was tearing up about the thought of the future the man just robbed him of, and he continued, "But she wouldn't just listen to me, and I took her to back alley, and my friend Jerome there helped me, and we decided that, have her if we can't really have her, so we drugged her burger, and took her to the back alley and dropped her in our van." And then he pointed towards Jerome, who had called police by now and was waiting in the corner. The man was confessing everything, and then he said, "And then we took turns on her. It was me first, and then Jerome. We forced ourselves upon her. I'm sorry, man. It was all in the moment when I realized what I had done. It was too late. I choked her." And then the man, bleeding from his mouth and in the most psychopathic laugh ever, laughed and said, "Jerome, didn't never gotta go." My friend was now in range, and he put the gun point blank at his head and shot him without hesitation, without feeling anything but rage. Even the dead man possessed his death late, and there was fear in his eyes as he was looking up at Carl, a 14-year-old kid with only vengeance in his eyes for the lover he lost. I was in shock. No words came out of my mouth, and I just stood there doing nothing. But Carl got up and said, "Hey, Jerome." Jerome looked at him, and without hesitation or anything, Carl shot Jerome the same way he did the cashier. I was in the corner where the cashier was shot. I couldn't process it. Police came in and arrested both of us, but prison was out, so a detention facility was marked for both of us. The evidence they found proved that the cashier and Jerome were responsible for Sydney's death, and this helped us gain some sympathy in front of the jury, and we got 3 years in juvenile detention center. It took my friend every bit of detention to get over what happened. We changed the cities, but we never let go of our friendship. And in a way, I don't think we will ever forget about Cindy, too.
In the early 20th century, Markia Serenko escaped from her home country of Russia, feeling the bloodthirsty Bolsheviks who were in the process of turning their native land into the political wasteland that was the USSR. She escaped over the border to China, who at the same time had yet to be consumed by communism as a temporary stopover on her way to the United States. However, It was in China that the superstitious Maria consulted a fortune teller, wishing to get a good idea of what her journey had in store for her. The Chinese fortune teller gave Maria some very good news indeed, telling her that not only would she successfully make it to the United States, but that she would give birth to a daughter whose beauty would become globally renowned. But under all circumstances, she should avoid so-called dark waters. Then, after making it all the way to San Francisco, Maria gave birth to a daughter on July 20th, 1938, naming her Natalia Nikolaevna Zarenko. Natalia would gain the fame that the fortune teller had predicted, but would be known by another name entirely. That name was Natalie Wood. Natalie's mother essentially groomed her for stardom from the time she learned to walk and talk. She sent her to singing, dancing, and acting lessons, training her to be a complete triple threat, before parading her around movie studios in the hopes that she would be discovered, and thus fulfill her destiny. It was such an intensive experience that it verged on abuse. Natalia's mother was utterly ruthless and unforgiving, separating her from her sister and even denying her medical assistance for injuries in the instance that this would only make her stronger. Maria paid close attention to the prophetic warnings of the fortune teller and made an effort to give Natalia a deep ingrained fear of deep water. Yet, despite her efforts, the fortune teller's predictions almost came true on the set of a movie called The Green Promise. During shooting, a young Natalie was set to run across a bridge that was set to collapse during a rainstorm, a bridge that just so happened to run over a pool of rough, dark water. The director insisted that the timing would be just right, and although there would be an element of on-screen peril, she would be entirely safe, but terrifyingly enough, one of the set stuff happened to pull the collapse mechanism too early, and Natalie broke her wrist as she fell into the water. Her mother was distraught, believing she was about to see the prophecy of drowning come true before her very eyes. But the set staff, acting quickly, helped Natalie pull herself to safety as she struggled to do so with a broken wrist. If she wasn't terrified of water beforehand, she certainly was then. Maria refused to get her daughter any medical assistance for the broken wrist either, believing that an insistence on doing so would deter directors from hiring her in the future. The injury scarred her wrist so heavily that Natalie went on instead on covering the scars with multiple bracelets for the rest of her life. Not only because she believed the wound was ugly, because it reminded her of one of the most traumatic instances of her life, so traumatic that she never, ever learned to swim, and was reported to have panic attacks whenever she tried to wash her hair. Despite her traumas, Natalie had a long and successful film career, and will go on to wed fellow star Robert Wagner. They had a rocky relationship, and naturally got divorced and remarried before having their one and only daughter, Natasha. Then, during Thanksgiving weekend of 1981, Natalie Roberts and another movie star, Christopher Walken, were enjoying some rest and relaxation aboard Wagner's yacht, named the Splendor, around the Catalina Island off the coast of California. Only one other person was with them, the boat's captain, a man named Dennis Davern. They spent the weekend shopping, sunning themselves, sailing, dining out, and profusely drinking on the night of November 27, 1981, after yet another evening of heavy drinking. An argument between Natalie and Robert broke out when it grew so intense that Natalie demanded that Captain Davern take her ashore on the small dinghy that was kept on board the Splendor. The pair then spent the night in a hotel before returning to the boat the following morning, when Natalie and Robert apparently talked things out and buried the hatchet. The following night, Robert, Natalia, Captain Davern, and Christopher Walken went ashore to dine in a restaurant called Doug's Harbor Reef. Here, they continued their stint of heavy drinking, reportedly ordering 2 bottles of wine, 2 bottles of champagne, and numerous daiquiris, with one of the waiting staff reporting that they barely touched their food. The proper people were so intoxicated that the restaurant manager reportedly called harbor security to ensure that they made it back to the boat safely that night. According to Captain Davern, Robert Wagner and Christopher Walken argued violently over politics, as well as the direction that Natalie's career should take. He has since stated that the argument grew so violent that one of the men threw an empty wine bottle at the other before Natalie had to get involved to separate the pair. The argument then shifts to one between Natalie and Robert, with Natalie apparently telling Robert that she'd had enough before retiring to her room for the night at around 3:30 a.m. The next morning, on November 29th of 1981, a ship-to-shore call was made from the Splendor, one in which Captain Davern reported to the U.S. Coast Guard that Natalie Wood was missing. A search begins, one that ended just a few hours later at around 8 a.m., when Natalie Wood's drowned body is found floating near the ship's inflatable dinghy, the very same one she had used to escape the boat just 2 days prior. She was wearing nothing but a nightgown, a pair of socks, and a jacket. The autopsy showed that she had a blood alcohol content of 0.14%, almost double the legal limit for driving. There was also evidence that she had taken a rather large amount of powerful painkillers, and the time before her death. She was just 43 years old when she passed away. Amazingly, on the day she died, Robert Wagner is not intensively questioned by police. It's only a few days later that the 3 men who were on the boat that night are brought in for questioning, and when they are each tells us suspiciously similar stories that details the evening's events. As a result, Natalie's death was assumed to be nothing more than an accidental drowning. The nation was dumbstruck by such a horrible, unforeseeable tragedy, and mourned in tandem with Robert Wagner, who went on to raise their 2 daughters as a single parent. 2 daughters who are almost inconsolable, distraught at the sudden death of their beloved mother. Natalie's death seemed to remain an open and shut case for an entire 30 years, until a shocking revelation turned public attention back onto the situation. Captain Dennis Davern, the man who had been captaining the Splendor that night, broke his silence on the case and came forward to state that he had in fact lied to the investigating law enforcement. The nation was shocked to hear that the argument that night between Walken and Wagner had not actually been rooted in politics, but the suspicion that Walken had been secretly flirting with Natalie whenever Robert Wagner's back was turned. As was previously mentioned, the argument then shifted to one between Wagner and Natalie after Walken that retired to his room. But then, when Natalie had tried to do the same and retire to bed, Robert Wagner had followed her to continue the argument. Then, sometime later, Wagner stormed up to Captain Davern, sweating and panicking, and told him to turn off all the boat's lights and ignore all onshore calls that came into the boat. In the aftermath, Davern claimed that Wagner kept him confined to his quarters in order to prevent him from giving a statement to the police, then held an impromptu meeting in which he ordered Walken and Davern to keep quiet about the arguments and to essentially give false statements to the police. In light of such statements, police reopened the investigation into Natalie Wood's death in the year 2012. A re-examining of the information gleaned from her autopsy had one coroner declaring that she had died as a result of drowning, but also from other undetermined factors. Then, in 2018, Wagner was officially named as a person of interest in Natalie Wood's death. Natalie's sister Alana came out and gave a media interview, stating that she believed Captain Davern's claims to be true, and had even confronted Wagner on the day of Natalie's funeral in an attempt to get him to reveal what had actually happened that night. This culminated in an appearance on the popular TV show Dr. Fell, in which Lena and Davern publicly accused Wagner of being solely responsible for Natalie's death. However, Lana was keen to make it clear that she didn't believe it to be outright murder, and that she didn't believe Wagner ever really intended to kill his wife, but either because lost in his rage during a heat-in-the-moment decision, possibly denying Natalie help when she had fallen into the water while trying to leave the boat to go ashore, just as she had done just 2 nights previous. Despite the accusations from her sister, Natalie's 2 daughters, Natasha and Courtney, stand by their father's version of events, saying he had done all he could to preserve the mother's legacy. Courtney is not even Robert's biological daughter, but adores him so much that she has even taken on his surname, potentially is a sign of loyalty and respect. She personally believes and has publicly stated that Captain Davern is a fabricator, one who simply wishes to make a name for himself, exploiting her mother's death for monetary gain, and these claims do carry some weight to them. For example, Davern not only took 30 years to come forward with his accusations, but was also, by his own admission, extremely drunk on the night in question. His story is apparently changed multiple times throughout the years, leaking seedy gossip to tabloid journalists the entire time. He had also written a book about the events of the night in question, one which has been analyzed and debunked by numerous people who asserted that Davern's version of events are extremely spurious. When asked about Devon's claims, Robert's biological daughter, Natasha, was reportedly said he is somebody who I cannot even dignify with a response because he is so undignified. As for Christopher Walken, the only other person aboard the Splendor that evening, he hasn't spoken much at all about the incident, keeping suspiciously quiet over the years. When asked about how he felt regarding the reopening of the case, he reportedly said, "I don't know," having previously said that he firmly believed Natalie's death to be a tragic accident. In conclusion, it's not entirely out of the question that an extremely intoxicated Natalie might have tried to use the very same dinghy she had used a few nights previous, and doing so, she could have simply fallen into the water and drowned while the other people on board were either too drunk to respond to her cries or simply below deck and unable to hear her entirely. Yet, it's also scarcely feasible that a jealous husband had discovered her infidelities, either perceived or real, thrown her into the sea in a rage, and simply used his influence or outright threats to cover up the murder. It has been 39 years since Natalie's tragic death, and we are still no closer to knowing the entire truth as to what happened to her that night. And it's not only her family and friends that deserve concrete answers, but society as a whole. Have we had a murderer walking among the Hollywood elite for the past 40 years or so? Or has an innocent man been subjected to a campaign of slander when he should have been given room to heal? Whatever happened that Thanksgiving weekend, one thing is painfully clear, that the dark prophecy told to Maria Zakharhenko by the Chinese fortune teller in the early 20th century did actually come true. And it was indeed dark waters that became the undoing of the young woman who came to be known to the world as Natalie Wood.